Well, I'm delighted to see, so many old friends, a couple of young friends, new friends that I haven't met yet. So again, welcome, and thank you for coming here this evening. I'm going to be talking, as you know, about something called the social neuroscience of empathy and compassion. And I'm going to be defining what I mean by all of those words. Whoops. You have to hold this in the right direction, and you actually have to turn it on first. So I'm going to be addressing a set of questions. One of them is, first of all, what is empathy and what is compassion? How are they different? And how are we going to go about trying to define them for the purposes of scientific study? Secondly, what has science actually contributed to understanding the empathy and compassion? What are some of the methods that we've used to try to go about that understanding? I want to include a good bit on what we've learned from the study of meditation practices, because many of these practices explicitly are in the service of the cultivation of compassion as well, of course, as wisdom. And then finally, I'm going to end with a bit of research that's quite recent, addressing this question of whether compassion can actually be trained, and how might we measure that to find out if that's the case. So that's our agenda for this evening. Well, okay, here we go. So first of all, empathy. So for psychologists and philosophers, empathy really describes some interrelated, though distinguishable, processes. So one of them that I'm going to emphasize is feeling what another person is feeling, a kind of resonating with the feelings of another individual. And a second, though related, is knowing what another person is feeling, our conscious representation. And of course, we can feel what another person is feeling without being able to consciously register in our own phenomenal awareness, or at least insofar as we can tell other people about it. And we may be able to know what another person is feeling in the abstract without necessarily feeling that ourselves. So they're partially dissociable. Compassion, I'll argue, builds upon empathy. So it includes empathy in its definition. Webster puts it as deep feeling for an understanding of misery or suffering. And here's the important part, and the concomitant desire to promote its alleviation. So it's not just feeling with another individual, it's not just understanding another individual's feeling, but when that feeling is one of suffering, of distress, it includes the desire to do something about that, to alleviate that person's distress. So how do we understand compassionate response to suffering? Well, until relatively recently, through most of modern history of science, scientific traditions and contemplative traditions have had a rather different take on how to understand compassionate response to suffering. Quite different perspectives. And so just to give one example, I don't want to make this a Buddhist-centric kind of presentation or discussion, but you'd probably all agree that Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama, has had a fair amount to say about compassion, represents a tradition in which compassion cultivation is certainly very front and center. So in a chapter published in 2002, he had this to say about compassion. An important support for my thesis that human beings are fundamentally compassionate is our natural ability to connect spontaneously and deeply with the suffering of others. There's a certain spontaneity and directness in our natural reaction. It indicates a profound interconnectedness among all living beings. So I want to emphasize a couple of phrases in what he wrote. One of them is this fundamentally compassionate. So an assumption within this tradition is that compassion is part of our human nature. It's not something we have to kind of develop de novo. It's something that a capacity at least that we bring into the world. Second, spontaneous, so that this isn't something that we have to necessarily effortfully engage in. In fact, the rudiments of it may be elicited kind of automatically, again, part of our human nature. And that it reflects a kind of fundamental interconnectedness. So we're going to take a look at some of the evidence for how that interconnectedness is evidenced, how it is that we in fact actually do resonate with the feelings of other beings. Contrast that with, published in this same book in 2002, some comments from Anne Harrington, philosopher of science at Harvard University, about the perspective of science. Anne writes, another reason that modern sciences of human behavior have not developed a systematic perspective on compassion is that these natural sciences are not really convinced that human beings are naturally compassionate. On the contrary, they tend to tell us that altruism and self-sacrifice are fragile, even slightly puzzling human qualities. So science has been rather influenced in the perspective it's taken by a kind of interpretation of evolutionary theory, and I think in our present day we would say probably something of a misinterpretation, a kind of nature red in tooth and claw, where self-centered preservation to pass along genes to the next generation is really the dominating motivation. And so difficult to understand, especially when compassionate actions are at a cost to the individual. That's what we mean by altruistic, that a person is doing it at some cost to themselves, some self-sacrifice. That's been rather difficult to understand. And it's really been only within the last several years that there's been some coming together of these different perspectives, not entirely, but principally through the development of what's being called social neuroscience. Now, some of you are familiar, Leslie mentioned in the introduction, the roles I played with the Mind and Life Institute. Mind and Life Institute brings together contemplative practitioners and teachers like the Dalai Lama, also featured in the photograph there, Mathieu Ricard, another noted contemplative, with Western scientists like myself, philosophers. This was a meeting I had chaired the organization of a few years back, focusing on compassion and health and meditative practice. But the real reason I'm showing it to you is that I've discovered that if you go to a talk having anything to do with happiness or compassion or empathy, there needs to be a photograph of the Dalai Lama standing in close proximity to the speaker. Otherwise, the talk is incredible. And the third reason is I had promised my wife I would never show a photograph of me and the Dalai Lama standing together in one of these talks. And so there you have it.
Never say never.
I want to use a framework that was introduced by Jean Desetti at the University of Chicago. He's been one of the more prolific contributors to the literature in social neuroscience. And in a chapter published in 2007, he brought together the then extant literature, reviewed it, and came to the conclusion that really in order to understand human empathy, we have to look at 4 functional components. Now, these dynamically interact with each other. They're not entirely separate. But his argument is that all 4 of those are really necessary for what we might call mature empathy and the kind of empathy that leads to compassionate action. I'll look at research that represents each of these different components, but just to tick them off, to orient you, the first of them, affective or emotional sharing between self and other, that's based on automatic, and again I want to underscore this, automatic perception-action coupling. Big mouthful. I'll describe a little bit more about what that really means. Second, self-awareness and self-other differentiation. We don't come into the world with a sense of self. We don't come into the world with a sense of being separate from other beings. That's something that matures developmentally, early in childhood, but nonetheless, it matures developmentally. The third, mental flexibility, and very critically, the ability to adopt the subjective perspective of the other, see things as though through the other's eyes. And then finally, and also very importantly, regulatory processes, especially emotion regulation. So let's begin by looking at those, starting with the first one, this notion of affective sharing. Any of you who are parents will know or remember interacting with an infant and the kind of mutual mimicry that goes back and forth. You make an expression, the baby makes an expression back at you. Animals do, other animals than humans do this as well. In the photograph on the top on the left side, there's a human sticking out his tongue, and then in the next frame, the little monkey doing the same sort of thing. Now, the claim is being made, and this was something that Frans de Waal at the Yerkes Primate Center, he's a primatologist, has contributed to majorly, that these really are automatic kinds of perception action mechanisms at play in this mimicry. In other words, they don't have to be consciously, volitionally instantiated. They occur automatically. So what's some of the evidence that justifies that kind of conclusion? And rather than looking at the animal studies, I want to focus on a particular human study. This one by Ulf Dimberg and colleagues in Scandinavia. And what they did is they took photographs of facial expressions of emotion, in this case, neutral, happy, and angry faces. And they flashed them very briefly and then followed them by a neutral face in a situation that's referred to as masking. What happens in this situation is all that people can report is seeing the neutral face. It's as if the neutral face masks or blocks from further conscious processing that very briefly shown emotionally expressive face. So people are not able to report being aware of seeing any kind of facial expression of emotion. Nonetheless, when they recorded with surface sensors the electromyographic activity, the activity of the underlying muscle regions, what they found was that this zygomatic, think of it as the smile muscle, increased in activity when people were being shown these masked happy faces that they were unaware of. And secondly, the corrugator activity, this kind of frown forehead muscle activity, increased when individuals were shown the angry faces, again, without any conscious recognition of the target face. So because this mimicry activity, this subtle muscle activity, is happening so quickly, happening without people being aware of the facial expression of emotion that they're being shown, and happening when that face is exposed so very, very briefly, it suggests that this is at least predominantly an automatic kind of response. Make sense? So how do we understand that? This is where something called mirror neurons begins to enter the picture. During the 1990s, a group of investigators in Parma in Italy were doing studies on how the brain controls movement activity, and they were using rhesus macaque monkeys in order to do electrophysiologic studies in the brain and better understand that. And they stumbled across an accidental observation, and that was when they were recording from neurons that they knew were active when the monkey was engaging in a certain kind of purposeful action, they saw that those same neurons were being active when the monkey was observing another engaged in the same intentional actions. Now, both observing monkeys engaged in those actions and observing humans engaged in those actions. So very puzzling. We had previously thought that motor and sensory neurons were relatively segregated, separated from each other. Here, seeing the same groups of neurons involved in this control of a particular purposeful movement, also firing when these monkeys were observing someone else, another being executing that same movement, and hence this term mirror neuron. Not very long after, studies in humans using functional magnetic resonance imaging showed that analogous areas, in other words, areas that map onto the same regions as where they observed these mirror neurons in monkeys, were becoming active both when humans were performing as well as observing others engaged in certain purposeful actions. Okay? Now, this seemed to occur, you could see it quite early developmentally. It seemed to have a lot of the characteristics of those things that are hardwired in the nervous system, given to us by our evolution. What does that have to do with empathy? Well, it turns out that there is also evidence for this kind of mirroring to occur in areas of the brain that are very involved in our affective or emotional response to our own pain, seen also when we observe the pain of another individual. So the study utilized this particular kind of setup. Individuals were shown a brief film sequence, and you see stills from that in the side left image, where it says neutral and then painful response. The cover story was, this is a person who has a very rare auditory disorder, and the treatment for that disorder is to expose them repeatedly to very loud and painful sounds. And so they're observing people grimacing in these painful expressions while they're inside the scanner, while they're inside the functional magnetic resonance imaging scanner. Observing the facial expression of another person in pain activated the same areas that were involved in one's own affective response to pain. And I list them there. The names are not particularly important for our purposes, but especially this anterior insula. In the lower left image, you see a brain where some retractors have pulled apart one of the major separations of areas of the brain, pulling down this temporal lobe, pulling up the frontal lobe, and you can see then deep within an island of kind of buried cortex that's known as the insula. It has lots of connections to the viscera of the body, to our guts. It has lots of connections to other emotionally important areas of the brain. And this is a principal region that was being seen if someone has experienced pain themselves, you see activation there. If that person is observing someone else in pain, you see activation there. So again, a kind of emotional mirroring within the brain. Now, this appears to occur relatively automatically, but that does not mean that all of our other conscious brain processes don't have any impact on it. So in this particular study, they did a manipulation where in one condition they told individuals to imagine that this was happening to themselves. In another condition, just be aware that it's happening to another individual. And then another manipulation that they called one of appraisal. Imagine that the treatment was effective versus imagine that the treatment was unsuccessful. Both of these manipulations modulated the degree of the activity. So clearly these other conscious processes setting the stage, if you will, they have an influence on this, what's in its fundamental is a kind of automatic response. So, do mirror neurons have anything to do with the cultivation of compassion in meditative practice? Well, it turns out there was a study that was done at the University of Wisconsin that addresses this question. Now, in order to talk about that study, I first of all need to make a distinction. Within the various contemplative traditions, there's often a distinction made between referential and non-referential compassion. So referential compassion is that directed toward a particular suffering being, whereas non-referential compassion is directed toward all suffering beings, no one excluded, including self. Now, the way in which the practice, the meditative practice, goes about trying to cultivate that sort of open, broad, inclusive compassion for all others, is to first of all practice opening the field of attention. So often what we call objectless meditation or open presence, and for those of you who have any familiarity with meditation practices, this is shikantaza in Zen or Dzogchen in Vajrayana, Tibetan Buddhist practice, choiceless awareness in Theravada, very similar across these different traditions. So in this study at the University of Wisconsin, they selected a group of expert Vajrayana Buddhist meditators, monks who had more than 10,000 hours experience on the cushion. Makes your butt hurt just sitting here in the chair for an hour, so you can imagine. 10,000 hours. And they compared them to novices, people who had been taught meditation for only a week, but just so that there wouldn't be any artifact introduced by these people doing something differently. They were all going to be measured while they were engaging in this non-referential compassion meditation. And while they were doing that, through earphones, they exposed the participants to emotional vocalizations, primarily distressing ones, cries, screams, that sort of thing. What they observed, the red line is the expert meditators, the blue line is the novices in all those graphs. In the different areas of interest, they saw a much larger response. This is a blood oxygen level dependent kind of response. It reflects how much blood and nutrients the brain is demanding from the blood supply. It reflects activity of neurons. So greater activity, particularly again in these areas that I had mentioned before, that we see active when observing the pain or distress of another individual, this insular cortex in particular. Now, also interesting, the strength of that insular activation was correlated with, related to what they reported about the intensity of their meditation session immediately afterwards. So it seems to co-vary with something they can subjectively tune into. So again, same area that we're seeing active when someone is in pain themselves, observing someone else in pain, amplified now in these long-term meditation practitioners who are hearing the sounds of pain, hearing the sounds of distress. Well, if the automatic aspect of this was all that empathy and compassion was about, we probably wouldn't have any kind of effective compassionate action ever occurring. Why? The automatic activation of shared experience alone very likely to lead to responses that are oriented toward the self. So watch little kids together. One of them starts crying, what happens? Everybody starts crying. Or one of them starts crying, another one walks over and whacks them, tell them to shut up. Why? It's felt as though it's occurring to oneself. And that's uncomfortable, that's unpleasant. And so what do when we have unpleasant experience? We do something to get rid of it, to minimize it, to get away from it. So empathic over-arousal, empathic distress are important ideas. And these, of course, as I'll show you in a moment, occur not only in children, but they occur in adults as well, particularly when those adults are primarily concerned with self, when they're very self-focused. So without the processes by which self and other are differentiated, and again, as I said, that happens developmentally, that comes online not right away from birth, and by which emotion is regulated, our ability to move from this kind of automatic empathic response to mature empathy and to true compassion would be very limited, wouldn't be possible, really. One of the kinds of research paradigms that's been used to look at, pardon me, whether an individual is able to differentiate self from other perspective is usually referred to as either mentalizing or theory of mind kinds of tasks. And one of them that's very often used, especially in looking at developing children, is something called the Sally Ann task, named because there's two little figures, one's Sally and one is Ann. And you probably can't see the image, and certainly not the writing underneath, so I'll explain. In that first frame on the top, you see Sally and Ann are there. Sally's got a basket next to her. Ann has a box next to her. Sally puts her ball in the basket, and then she goes away. When she's gone, Ann takes the ball out of the basket and moves it to the box. Now, the critical question is, where will Sally look for the ball? Don't answer it because you're going to give yourself away, just in case, you know. So if the child, and usually this happens around 4.5, 5 years of age, is able to take the perspective of another, that is, knows, can simulate that Sally didn't see Ann put the ball in the box. If it's a younger child, they're going to say, well, Sally is going to look in the box because that's where they, the participant, the child, has seen it move to. If they have this mentalizing ability, this ability to simulate the perspective of another, they're going to say, Sally's going to look for it in the basket because that's where Sally left it. That's what Sally saw. And it turns out in imaging studies that there are particular correlates of this, some of which overlap with these areas that I mentioned in these mirror neuron regions. Others are located somewhat differently in this kind of junction between the temporal and the parietal lobes. But what's important in this is that there are specific brain regions, some of which are kind of sensitive to detection of human movement, and some of which are able to manipulate the perspective of that as if seeing through the eyes of another. Very important component. Otherwise, we can't differentiate that this unpleasant experience I'm reverberating to isn't just happening to me, that it's really someone else that I'm feeling with, not simply feeling my own experience. Well, we may have the capacity for perspective taking, but we don't always utilize it, right? We can get stuck, not being very flexible, and see it only from our own point of view, including in adulthood, of course. So a number of other studies, a fairly substantial body of research has shown that errors in taking the perspective of others typically stem from an inability to shift away from one's own self-perspective. What are the things that prevent us from being able to shift away from our own perspective? You probably all know them fairly well. Fear. When we're afraid, we're focused on our own well-being. Anger. We're focused on what we can do to get some frustration out of the way. And greed. And of course, greed is just another manifestation of fear. We're afraid that what we got is going to get taken away, or we're not going to get enough of it, or there's a limited amount of pie that's available out there. So an essential aspect of accurate empathy seems to be this mental flexibility in shifting perspective that, depending on our emotional state, may or may not work very well for us. Now, self-focused perspective taking, it also turns out, arouses more intense empathic distress, this uncomfortable feeling when feeling with another individual. And it's manifest not only in one's phenomenal or subjective experience, but also in physiologic manifestations. Our skin becomes moist because the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic branch of it, connects to these micropores on our skin surface, and more moisture is excreted. We can measure it in changes in heart rate, other kinds of ways. Intuitively, we might expect that the person who is more physiologically aroused by another person's distress would be the one who is more compassionately responsive, acts in a more altruistic way. But as it turns out, and many of these studies have been done by Nancy Eisenberg, a colleague up at Arizona State University. Several of her studies and those of others find that those who show greater physiologic emotional response to someone else's distress actually tend to be more self-focused, less empathic, and less altruistic in response to that distress. Again, why? Empathic distress is uncomfortable. We try to get rid of it. We try to turn away. Okay? So not only this differentiation of self from other, but really a need here for some way to regulate that level of emotional arousal. And so that's that last category that Dissetti talked about, emotion regulation. Several groups, James Gross at Stanford has been one of the major figures in this. We've been doing work in the past in my own laboratory, reappraising the meaning and personal relevance in a laboratory situation of emotional images ends up reducing facial expression of emotion and also these autonomic physiologic responses as well as brain responses. There's a brain region deep in the temporal lobes called the amygdala. And think of it as kind of a vigilance system. A vigilance especially for potential threat. It activates pretty quickly. Well, when we reappraise a situation, we say, oh, that's just a photograph, or, that blood in that image, that's really just ketchup that they put on it. Different way of meaning making of it. It reduces those physiologic responses principally by some nerve cells within the frontal lobes that connect to and inhibit this amygdala. They come online. That's how we regulate emotion. Sometimes when I talk about emotion regulation, people think we're talking about some sort of, sitting on emotion, right? And I'm just not going to let them see me sweat. If you do that, if you try to inhibit the expression of emotion, what happens is that, first of all, you're not very effective in inhibiting that expression. It leaks through. Other people can see it. Secondly, it actually increases your physiologic arousal, probably because of the energy demands of that effortful inhibition. Okay? That makes sense? Now, this has some real-world implications. Here's another study by Cheng and colleagues published in 2007. They looked at physicians who had been trained in the practice of acupuncture and compared them to naive participants who weren't trained in acupuncture while watching needles being inserted into various body parts. So for the acupuncture naive individual, this looks painful, right? You see people being poked with needles. For the acupuncturist, it has a different meaning. It's appraised in a different way. It's a treatment. It's an intervention. And so, not surprisingly, for these acupuncture naive individuals, the control individuals, there was activation in this insula, in the somatosensory cortex, where the particular body areas would be represented, and in another area that comes online in our emotion response to pain. But not so for those trained in acupuncture. They made different meaning of it, and what they showed was predominantly activation of these areas I just was talking about. This middle and upper part of the frontal lobes, important in the regulation of emotion response. These temporal parietal areas that are involved in theory of mind. Okay? So these things are playing their role in all kinds of situations like this, some of which we can bring into the laboratory and examine. There's some evidence that in long-term meditators, we did a study a little over a decade ago. My then graduate student, Liz Nielsen, who's now a senior program officer at the National Institute on Aging, we recruited individuals who were either very long-term meditation practitioners, 10 or more years, and we drew them from the Zen and Vipassana practice communities. We didn't see any differences between those two practice traditions, by the way. And we compared them to individuals who were not meditation practitioners. And then we also had a group of what we called short-term meditation practitioners, 5 years or less of experience. We showed them emotionally evocative images, a kind of standard set that's used in this kind of research. Here you have examples of the unpleasant ones. So you see a number of threat kinds of images, some distressing, sad kinds of images. We also use neutral images, and we use pleasant images as well. And in one condition, we simply showed them for 6 seconds. We recorded various physiology. We asked them about their subjective response. In another condition, like that facial expression study, we masked these images. And before and immediately after a very brief flash of the emotionally evocative image, only 45 milliseconds, there was a scrambled visual noise that we worked on for about a year to make sure it was the right color contrast and effectively masked any conscious registration of that image. No one was able to guess about there being any kind, well, two people guessed that there might have been something between the jumbled image flashes, and they were dead wrong in their guess. So no conscious registration of this. And then after a very brief pause, we inquire about their subjective experience using a nonverbal technique. So we get an estimation of how pleasant versus unpleasant they're feeling, how aroused, from very highly aroused, very quiescent. Now remember, in this condition, nobody is aware that they've seen anything that's emotionally evocative. So they're simply reporting on their present affective state, their present emotional state. What we found is that for those long-term meditators, in comparison to the other two groups, first of all, on a lengthy questionnaire, they reported much higher emotional clarity. In other words, they reported that they felt they were able to sense their emotion experience quite readily. They were able to differentiate one emotion from another. And for those with this higher clarity, they showed lower physiologic as well as subjectively experienced arousal in response to the images that they didn't consciously see. And they also showed greater subtle positive facial expression. So again, even though these aren't being consciously registered, they're manifesting in our physiology, manifesting in subtle ways in our facial expression. And because we stop the conscious processing very early, before it really gets access to what we can report, this regulation of emotion in these long-term meditators has to be happening very, very early in the process. That seems to occur with long-term practice. So to finish up, I want to address this question of whether compassion can be trained and measured. And this is something, of course, that the Center for Compassion Studies here at the U of A is very concerned with. Leslie is very involved in some programs that are attempting to train compassion and assess the consequences of that. And I'm going to tell you about that and a few other ways of going about this. So remember, I said that compassion builds upon empathy, adding to it this desire to alleviate another's suffering. So various ways secular compassion training programs, usually relatively brief, anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks in length, have been developed. Most of them have been derived from Buddhist meditation and mind training approaches where compassion is systematically endeavored to be cultivated. One of them, the one being investigated mostly here at the U of A, is called cognitive-based compassion training. And it was something that was developed by Geshe Lobsang Negi, a former Tibetan Buddhist monk who's at Emory University, based upon a set of Tibetan practices, for those of you who know something about this, called Lojong training. Another rather similar, slightly different one, compassion cultivation training. Geshe Thupten Jinpa at Stanford University developed this particular one. Again, some considerable similarities with cognitive-based compassion training, or CBCT. There's another developed at the University of Wisconsin, short-term compassion training. And then a third developed by a Western Tibetan Buddhist Lama, Lama Willa Miller at Harvard, simply called compassion meditation. All of them having a number of similarities. Now, there are more studies available than we have time to look at this evening, so I'm just going to highlight a few of them for you to give you an idea of some of the kinds of results that are accruing. Gael Desbordes and colleagues took a look at this cognitive-based compassion training that was developed at Emory. They compared that to, which was an 8-week training program, to 8 weeks of attention-focused meditation training, really just focusing attention on sensitivity to breath signals. Okay? two types of common meditation practice. What they found then, studying these individuals when they were not meditating in the scanner, is that they showed different changes within their brain response, and those changes in brain response were particular to these different meditation training programs when they showed individuals these kind of emotional images, as I've been showing you, same kind that we used in our study. Now, again, two important things. They used a health education and discussion class as a control. So this isn't something that's just happening because, you're measuring things 8 weeks apart, not happening simply because people are in some kind of a class and everybody thinks they're going to get better when they're in some kind of a class. Something seems to be more specific to these trainings themselves that's reflected in brain activation to emotionally salient images. Well, it's all great, we like to know what the brain is doing, but what we're really concerned with, of course, is whether people are going to act compassionately in the real world. Another study, Helen Wang and colleagues from University of Wisconsin, this short-term compassion training that they developed, they compared that to an emotion regulation reappraisal training, basically just teaching people how to better regulate their emotion. What they found was that unique to the short-term compassion trained individuals, they showed an increase in altruistic redistribution of funds to a victim in an economic decision-making game. So this is a kind of game you can bring into the laboratory. It simulates what happens in real-life economic decision-making. It's used in this domain of behavioral economics quite a bit. And interestingly, this increase in altruistic behavior in this economic decision-making game was correlated or associated with a change in the activation of brain images that I've been telling you about that are implicated in empathy, in perspective taking, and in emotion regulation. So now we've got some evidence that these brain changes that we're seeing actually have some link to real behavior. Well, economic decision-making games are one thing. But what about when we encounter real individuals? Another recent study by Paul Condon and colleagues compared 8 weeks of either mindfulness meditation training or compassion meditation training. And in this study, they didn't find those to be any different. So we've got a question being raised about what's really the active ingredient. Is it maybe any kind of meditation that might be resulting in these kinds of hoped for, if you will, sort of outcomes? The meditators, compared to those who were weightless controls, in other words, who were just measured twice over that same interval, they weren't given any training, they more frequently offered their seats to an injured person. Now, this situation, they brought people into the laboratory. There was a waiting room, and they were told they were going to be with some others waiting for their turn to come in and fill out some questionnaires. In fact, what was going on is the participant was there, all the other people were collaborators of the investigator. You know how social psychologists do that kind of stuff. Now, in that kind of a situation, there's a phenomenon called a bystander apathy effect. If there's other people around, you're much less likely to actually come to the aid of another individual. Sad but true. And for the people who were in the waitlist control, both before and after this waiting period, they demonstrated a very low frequency of getting up and giving their seat to this person who was on crutches with a cast, obviously in some degree of pain, grimacing, didn't give up their seats. Those trained in either of the two meditation conditions, significantly more likely to get up and release their seat. So we've got some beginnings of evidence that, in fact, maybe these things are actually having some consequences out in what people do in real life social interaction. So I want to close with some comments about the future of investigation in this area. I want to emphasize that scientific study of empathy, compassion training, very early stage. This has not been going on for more than about the past 15 years or so. And most of that research really just in the past 5 years. There are a number of both conceptual and methodologic issues. My colleague Richie Davidson at Wisconsin and I published a a paper late last year reviewing those issues, making some recommendations for ways to improve research in this area. But it is the case that increasingly rigorous studies are now being published and the area is growing rapidly, and I find that to be encouraging. Why should we care? Why should we care about it? You know, one reason is it keeps neuroscientists off the street and they create havoc when they're, running loose. Another reason, however, is I hope, as I've been able to illustrate, we begin to learn some things about what facilitates and what inhibits empathic response, compassionate action. And I think those become important pieces of information that can guide how it is we go about in real-life training situations trying to enhance compassionate capacity and activity. So vitally important in healthcare settings. Gosh, we could use some in our political arenas. Huh? All kinds of settings where compassion seems to be at a not very high level. Why? What's getting in the way of what begins with some humanly common basic building blocks of our ability to resonate with other individuals? So I'm encouraged about possibilities for the future. Thank you so much for being here this evening.